Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome back to the second half of our symposium about social cognition. I hope you've all had time to get a coffee, hopefully by not standing in a long queue for university coffee as it would be if we were physically at the EPS meeting. Maybe you've got a better coffee machine at home. And so for the second half of the symposium, we have two more talks on social cognition, and I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Ivana Konvalinka, who is an associate professor at the Technical University of Denmark, and she does some fascinating research on interpersonal interactions and physiological coupling between people, and she's going to tell us about both neural and behavioural mechanisms when people are playing a mirror game. Thank you for being here, Ivana. Okay.
Thanks so much, Antonia, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be part of this. And thanks, Gustav and Bert, for amazing talks. This is a really weird setup, so let's see how it goes. I'm going to be talking about, some of the mechanisms underlying both interaction and observation in a mirror game paradigm. And I just want to say this is really preliminary results. It's actually data we finished collecting just before the lockdown in Denmark, so thankfully. But yeah, just take it with a grain of salt for now. So I'm going to assume that most of you who are listening in are familiar with two-person neuroscience, and that's the movement in the last decade and a half away from studying social cognition in individual observers, so individuals who are isolated from a real social interaction while observing some kind of social computerized stimuli, towards studying two or more persons engage in interaction with each other, the so-called two-person interactive approach. And this came about with a proposal that social cognition is fundamentally different when we engage in interaction than when we observe. And social cognition mechanisms in two or more person dynamic interactions have been labeled as the so-called dark matter of social neuroscience. And what I would like to talk about today is consider this scenario. So if you look at the axis along participation, it goes from observation of inert stimuli towards structured interaction. And as both Gustav and Bert discussed very interestingly about, there's an observation scenario often in social interaction where we're not just watching interactions on our TV, but we're more participatory observers, and we have an effect on the actors who are being observed. And so there's a difference there's also probably a fundamental difference between online and offline observation. I don't know why there's a question mark there. I'm not going to answer what that is. But there's limited, this is very difficult to study, and there's very limited studies comparing mechanisms of social observation and interaction in the same kind of social context. So in other words, many of the studies that we've begun doing using the two-person approach look at two co-actors who have feedback of each other's behavior, and there's kind of closed loop because they both adapt continuously to each other's behavior and influence each other mutually. But there's also a kind of mutual, more indirect coupling between the actor being observed and this participatory observer, which is a little bit more difficult to measure. So the actor being observed is surely affected by the observer themselves. And kind of the real life example that we can think of is in theater performance, where the behavior of the actors is surely different when there's an audience that's present rather than one that's not present there. And that hasn't been looked at so much in the literature. So there's all kinds of neural mechanisms, overlapping neural mechanisms between observation and interaction. I'm going to gloss over all of them and just focus on mu suppression, because here we're doing a dual EEG study. And for those of you who don't know, the mu rhythm is a rhythm over the motor cortex, which has a component both at 10 hertz and 20 hertz, which has a high amplitude when we're at rest and which suppresses in amplitude when we move. But it also suppresses when we observe others producing actions. And Rita Hari showed this in '98. So this is a figure of 20 hertz time course, left Rolandic time course, and you can see that the amplitude is quite high when people are at rest, that it suppresses when they view someone moving, and also when they act themselves. And there's also been quite a few studies looking at mu rhythm suppression when we engage in interaction with others, other people versus, for example, computer signals who are non-responsive to each other. And what we have found is that there's a higher mu rhythm suppression when we interact with others in a kind of bidirectional scenario. And so the topography is sort of over the central electrodes, which are contralateral to the moving hand. And so one of the things I'm going to show today is some data looking at mu modulation during observation versus observed action versus interaction, among other things. And so we wanted to sort of turn to have a kind of experimental paradigm of this theater improvisation, and we were inspired by the mirror game paradigm from Liornoy and colleagues, where they had two people, they had actually expert improvisers, in our case we don't have experts, seated across from each other, and they were asked to move this bar in one dimension, and they were instructed to imitate each other, create synchronized and interesting motions, and enjoy playing together. And so we turned this into our own experimental setup. And so this in the corner is Mario Zimmerman, who is my postdoc and who did all the hard work in both developing this paradigm and also building it in collaboration with DTU Skylab. And so what we had was people seated across from each other who were asked to move these sliders, again, in one dimension and create interesting motions. And we manipulated whether they could see each other or not by being able to turn the screen on and off. And then we measured dual EEG. And we had 27 pairs of non-expert improvisers. Or we didn't actually ask them if they were expert or not, but I assume they were non. They're mostly engineering students. So our experimental conditions, in the case when they could see each other, we had, of course, the coupled scenario where they both had visual feedback of each other, and they were asked to create interesting motions, but also synchronize with each other. We had the observation scenario where one person was asked to create interesting movements while being observed by the other person. We had a leader-follower scenario where they could both see each other. They were mutually coupled, but one person was designated the role of leader and the other the role of the follower. We had the uncoupled scenario where they couldn't see each other and they just had to produce their own movements. And we also had, it's a lot of conditions, but it's partly exploratory. So we had a movement control condition where we wanted to kind of have the same behavior from the two people, which appears coupled, but where they don't interact. So we had a moving dot on the screen, which was actually taken from data from people in the coupled condition, and both people had the same moving dot, and so they were asked to synchronize with it. So there was no so it was kind of a forced interaction, but no interaction between the two people. And so we hypothesized, according to previous research, that people would synchronize best in a bidirectionally coupled interaction with no designated leader. This is facilitated by the bidirectional flow of information, but we also hypothesized that people would produce smoother and more predictable movements when they were in this bidirectionally coupled interaction. We hypothesized that people will change their movements, so when being observed, rather than being in the uncoupled scenario, by producing a smoother, perhaps more predictable movement. So by taking the other person into account somehow, as if they were part of, like a part of this interaction in a remote sense. We predicted that there would be stronger mu suppression during coupled interaction and observed action than uncoupled, replicating previous work. And we also expected stronger mu suppression when observing action compared to rest. And so just to show you some of the raw movement data, so this is from the coupled condition. And what we see at the top, so this is just single trial data. We see a rather smooth movements from the two people interacting in this bidirectional condition, which we see quite a lot, so very like regular movements. But we also, in the second plot, in the bottom plot, we also sometimes see people playing around more with each other. So sometimes they speed up or they go back slowing down. They change the amount of movement that they produce as well. In the uncoupled scenario, we see a lot more jittery movements, so a lot less smooth and kind of unstructured movements that people produce. And then at the top, in the movement control condition, we see what we were actually hoping for. So the two participants in blue and red seem to be synchronized, even though they're not interacting with each other, because they're following this green moving dot. And so this condition, I should say, is not so interesting for the stuff I'm going to present today. It was more meant to serve as a control for the interbrain analysis. But I'm not presenting any of that today. We're not there yet. And the leader-follower condition, we see some more like stop-and-go movements and some more jitter, both on the leader and the follower, and we see that the follower lags behind the leader. And then I just wanted to show from one trial data from an observed actor, but it's difficult to conclude anything from the raw data. So first, we look at how do people synchronize, and here we extract the phase from each person's signal, and then we look at the relative phase distribution from -pi to pi, and so if they're not synchronized, we should see a uniform distribution. And so what we see as predicted is that in the coupled scenario, they synchronize best and with the 0 relative phase, so they're in phase with each other. Whereas in the uncoupled, we see a uniform distribution, so they don't have feedback of each other, so this is just proof of concept. In the leader-follower scenario, we see that they still synchronize quite well, but at a lag, because the follower lags behind the leader. And also, so the control data is synchronization between the people and the moving dot, not from each other. When we look at it between each other, then it's actually higher. But towards the moving dot, they synchronize less well than in the leader-follower scenario and still at a lag. So because the moving dot, of course, doesn't have feedback of them. And then we wanted to look at some of the individual movement parameters, and this is still quite preliminary because we're still analyzing this data and looking for new ways to analyze it. So at first, we just looked at the average traveled distance. So how much do they move across the different conditions? And what we find is that there's less movement in the bidirectionally coupled condition. So presumably also if they're kind of a bit more regular and moving slower, then there's going to be less movement. But we still have to look at the velocity of these movements. The control condition is mostly driven by the dot, the condition that we feed in, so it's less variable. But here we don't see any difference in the amount of movement between the uncoupled condition in orange and the yellow one, which is the actor who is being observed. However, interestingly, so we also wanted to see the amount of jitter in their movements, and we define jitter as within the frequency range of 2 to 3 hertz of their movement, so according the same way that Leonore defines it. And our measure is a little bit different because here we look at the power spectral density within 2 to 3 hertz in relation to the power spectral density across all the frequencies of movement, so from say 2.2 hertz to 3 hertz. And what we find here is that we find smoother movement as is expected, so less jitter in the bidirectionally coupled condition. But interestingly, we see also smoother movements when moving while being observed, so from the observed as an observed actor rather than in the uncoupled condition when they're not being observed. So even though there's the same amount of movement. So there's something that they do that falls kind of in between the coupled and uncoupled condition when they're being observed. And then I hope this is not flashing for you as it is for me, but we look at the modulation of the mu rhythm and the occipital alpha oscillations. And so this is absolute power first over the left central electrodes. And so as expected, we find higher mu suppression for the coupled and controlled conditions versus uncoupled and observed action conditions. And of course, much more suppressed against the rest condition, the non-movement condition where they see a fixation cross. We also see more mu suppression for the observed action versus unobserved. So the yellow bar, which is the actor who's being observed, versus the red one where they're uncoupled. And we don't see, so this is kind of interesting because again, it falls right in between the coupled and the uncoupled conditions. And so we still haven't related this back to the behavior. It might be because of the way they move, and we cannot answer that until we've looked at it. Strangely, we don't see any difference between the observer when they're observing someone moving as when they're at rest in the mu suppression. So, and this could be because our task is quite different from the previous task. So they're asked to observe someone who's moving for 26 seconds. It could be that they lose interest. And we definitely want to look at the temporal aspect. Maybe it's stronger at the beginning, or maybe they're just less engaged in this scenario. Maybe the actions have no context for them. But we don't see any effect here. And for the alpha suppression, so this is a occipital alpha suppression because this is also a visual task. And here we see similar results. So we see a higher occipital alpha suppression for coupled rather than uncoupled and observed action. We also see a higher alpha suppression for observed action versus unobserved. And here we also get an effect on the observer when they're observing someone moving rather than at rest, which is sort of to be expected because they are more visually engaged in this task when they're looking at someone. But it's still interesting that we see it for the occipital alpha, but not for the mu. Okay, so I actually think I have more time, but I've been rushing through. Just to conclude some of the current findings, so we find that people synchronize best when bidirectionally coupled without a designated leader, producing smoother and fewer movements. And in a leader-follower scenario, they synchronize better when the leader has feedback of the follower. So if we look at the leader-follower scenario compared to the control scenario. And this sort of replicates a lot of the previous work, so it's proof of concept. We find that people produce smoother movements when observed versus unobserved. Even though they move the same amount. So of course, we cannot say from this measure whether it's because they produce slower movements or not, but we do see that they move the same amount. We find mu rhythm suppression across all the movement conditions, so that's good. That's just proof of concept, but it's strongest for the bidirectionally coupled and control condition. And this is probably the ones that are the most engaging. I mean, the control condition is actually quite hard to do because they have to follow this moving dot that doesn't respond to them at all. And this is followed by the observed action condition and followed by then the uncoupled condition. And the same trend for the occipital alpha. So we don't find any mu suppression, as I said, during observation, but we do find a higher occipital alpha suppression during observation and rest. And as I said, this is very preliminary, so there's a lot of ongoing work that we're doing in future work. And so we're doing some ongoing analysis to better quantify the behavioral movement parameters. So looking at the complexity measures and also the velocity and other signatures. And we're also looking at beta oscillations, and we're going to relate the behavioral measures to the neural measures. Of course, one of the main reasons we did this study is because we wanted to get a better characterization of interbrain synchronization. And so this is also why it was partly exploratory. We wanted to look at, on the one hand, phase and amplitude coupling, not just when people interact, but when we also have some proper control conditions in place. So when they move in the exact same way, but there's no interaction between them. And also we wanted to look at this case of observation, whether we also find some interbrain synchronization there. And of course, we want to do a method comparison because we do see quite different results across methods. And so we want to extract the most reliable interbrain synchronization measure. Hopefully we find one. And then sort of put the interbrain synchronization, make that an independent variable. So in the fall, we're planning on running a two-brain neurofeedback study where we plan to causally manipulate the interbrain synchronization and then see in turn whether that has an effect on interpersonal behavioral synchronization. So the way we're thinking of doing this is having a kind of neural feedback task which resembles the mirror game paradigm, and we see these moving dots, except in the neural task what we will feed back is the two persons' neural data, and this will be based on what we find to be the best measures of interbrain sync, or the best signals that synchronize between people. And then of course we plan to have different groups that get different feedback to control for the kind of interbrain task that they're doing, and then see subsequently if this has an effect on how they coordinate behaviorally. And so this is kind of a follow-up to Giacomo Novembra's brain stimulation study, where they induce interbrain sync via stimulation. We tried to do this without the stimulation itself. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to my postdocs, Marius and Ariana, and especially Marius, who's done a lot of the work in building up this task, and with the help of DTU Skylab, who has provided us with a lot of the resources and help in the building. And I'd like to thank Willem Funden for the funding support. And thank you. That's all.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was a great talk. Really, really fascinating data. If anyone has any questions, please post them here in the chat. Someone's been saying the chat froze, but refresh your browser. It is there. It will work. I will start by asking a question about, well, so you're going to be looking for the interbrain synchronization. What are you actually looking for there? What do you think you're going to see, or what will it mean when you find it?
Yeah, that's a good question. To be honest, to be very perfectly honest with you, I've always been very skeptical of interbrain synchronization, but I've also never really directly studied it. And I think what we want to do is we want to, so originally we wanted to look at it between the mu rhythms, whether we see this kind of as just a reflection of synchronized behavior. So looking at a synchronization between mu rhythms, but then not only in phase, but also in amplitude, because we know that the amplitude is what's affected. And the one thing that's very confusing about the phase when it comes to mu, of course, is that the mu rhythm, the amplitude suppresses. So there's less of it in a sense. So it's a little bit
and then
more
it's hard to
difficult
get a phase measure.
It's very difficult to get a phase measure. So at the moment, this is turning out to be more as like a method comparison rather than anything else, because we do see that the parameters that we set do have a huge effect. And kind of a little bit on the worrying front is that on some of the measures, we actually see some more interbrain synchronization during the rest condition, which could again be explained by just higher amplitude. So I think it's a little more exploratory in that sense. And on the other hand, we just wanted to find the most reliable measure for the neurofeedback study to see whether there is some kind of functional significance to the interbrain synchronization rather than just the effect of the behavior.
Cool. One question here from Ole says, did the participants enjoy the task, or did they find it challenging? I think this is playing the actual mirror game.
I think they enjoy it. I think they enjoy the task quite a bit. So it's a fairly long experiment, but I think in general they do enjoy it. Yeah.
I mean, each block is 30 seconds or so, and then they're doing repeated blocks, or?
Yeah, so we have 16 blocks per condition of 26 seconds each, and randomized, of course.
Yeah. Here, another question from Julio. It says, great talk. I was wondering if you've looked at factors which might explain differences between dyads in the movement or in the interbrain synchronization. And have you asked the dyads how they experience the coupling? Could they tell if they were coupled, and how good are they at judging that?
Yeah, so we actually haven't asked that in this study. It's a really great question. So we are planning on looking at, of course, in how like interdyadic differences more in relation to behavior. So not just looking at interbrain synchronization as a difference between conditions, but how it's influenced by kind of the behavior they produce. But it's a great question. So we haven't actually asked them that in this study. We have done that in other studies. And one thing that's really interesting, what I've found in some of the other studies, is that the dyads experience sometimes better synchronization when they're interacting with a more regular partner. So not necessarily when they're better synchronized, but when the partner is more regular. So for example, in a previous study, we saw that they experienced better synchronization in a very forced leader-follower scenario, where they were following someone who didn't have feedback of them, even though they synchronized worse in this condition. But this partner was more regular in a sense. So yeah, I think there's something to tap into there for sure.
Yeah. Cool. And one more question come up here. Cami says she's curious as to what extent do people notice or value or experience the interaction condition as something social and more social than the other conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer that. I think so that's of course something we probably can't see in the behavior, but more in the subjective ratings, which I mean, personally, I never get very strong differences across subjective ratings in these conditions. So yeah, I mean, this is a very low level task. So it's not a real life scenario. So surely it's not the same kind of social effect. But having said that, I think that it feels like a much more social task when you're coupled than when you do this with a control stimuli that doesn't respond to you, which is, I think, a very difficult type of interaction. Yeah, but I can't fully answer like to what extent it's more social.
Okay. A question from Priyasha is, could you expand a bit more on the behavioural measures that you might correlate with the interbrain synchrony? You mentioned velocity, but are there any other social cues that might be important?
Yeah, so I mean, so we're looking, of course, at interpersonal synchronization and how it relates to interbrain synchronization. That's an obvious one. But on the individual levels, I think we're looking at how much they move, the amount of movement, how smooth their movements are. So like jitter measures, how fast they go. And also we're going to look at different complexity measures. So perhaps using CRQA or something like that to extract like more dynamic measures of complexity. Yeah, but it's rather exploratory.
Cool. And one last question here says, this is Roxy, says, did you control for gender among your dyads?
No, we didn't. So it's a mix of mixed gender dyads, and also so sorry, I don't have the information handy of what it is, but we didn't control for this, and I mean on these very low level tasks, I've never seen gender effects, so so it's just not something that was of interest for us.
Yeah, no, I don't particularly look for gender effects in my studies, but we don't normally see them either. And I think with the kind of sample sizes that we're doing, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it.
Exactly. So. Yeah. And I mean, I think that I'm also very skeptical when I look at in these very low level cooperative and coordination studies, when studies report gender effects, they're very small effect sizes. And they're not very social tasks either. So it's really difficult to interpret even those very small effect sizes. So I don't personally find that so interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. It's a question we always get asked.
I know, it's true. There's many gender effects to be explored, I guess, but...
Cool. Okay, that is all of the questions from our audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Ivana, for a fabulous talk. That was really interesting. We have one more talk in today's session, and we need to switch about. Natalie, you have video now. We can see you. Great.
Just didn't want to be distracting, so I switched it off while Ivana was speaking.
Yeah, good idea. So for our final talk this morning, our speaker is Natalie Sabantz from the Central European University, and she's a professor of cognitive science and has really pioneered an enormous amount of research on joint action and how people act together and coordinate together. And she's going to be telling us today about how people coordinate decisions in joint action. Thank you for being here, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for putting together this symposium, and I'm really very happy to be part of this. So today I would like to tell you about a few studies we did recently that look at how people decide on how to coordinate. And so this sort of takes us into the realm of decision making of sorts. But first, just to embed this a bit in a larger context, let me remind you that people didn't always used to think of cognition as something social and of the mind as particularly social. So of course, as you know, in the early days of cognitive science and more generally explorations into the human mind, there was very much a focus on the individual, and people were, focused on how individual perception works, how individual thinking works. And we've come a long way in acknowledging that we are very fundamentally social, and our brains and minds are fundamentally social. This is very obvious when we think about our own evolutionary history, but also when we look at how we grow up, where we are, even before we are born, steeped into social interactions and learn from others all the time. Now, even though there's a lot of agreement these days that we need to take into account the social nature of humans when we want to understand the human mind, when it comes to this more specific question of what is special about social cognition, or perhaps more generally, what is cognition like, or what are our minds like, you can have somewhat different views on how we should consider the role of the social. And so I thought it might be useful to draw a distinction between two ways of thinking about this. So one is to focus on dedicated socio-cognitive abilities that we have, such as the way we process faces or others' bodies, our ability to recognize emotions, to observe or detect biological motion. Oh, now my view just switched and I can't see all of my slide. Now it's back again. All right, I wasn't pushing any buttons, but here we go. So these are really just examples, how we perceive biological motion, how we understand others' actions, how we attribute mental states. These are all processes where you could say they are special in the sense that we seem to have them specifically for interacting with others. But at the same time, you could also see cognition as something that is even more fundamentally social, in the sense that there are many, many different processes of perception, but also action planning and motor control and cognition that are all shaped by social interaction, which sort of undermines this categorical distinction between social versus non-social processes, or social versus non-social cognition. It's actually not really obvious to say what is not social about cognition. And I think we can, so here's an example. If you imagine you just met a friend at the market and he told you he's planning to bake a cherry pie, but he hasn't found any nice cherries yet. And then you yourself go to the greengrocer, even though your intention is to buy tomatoes, you might very well find your attention shifting to the cherries. And so even though it's not your own intention, you are influenced by the conversation you just had with your friend. And that's a very sort of everyday and, in a sense, trivial example of how your attention can be shifted by social interactions that you've had. We can see this sort of strong influence of social interaction on all kinds of processes, especially in the context of joint action, where people coordinate their actions in space and time in order to achieve common goals. So the way we attend to the world together, the way we include others in our action planning, and potentially also the way we make decisions is all influenced by this joint action context. And before I go to decision making, I just want to give you one example from this domain of perception and another one from the domain of action. So with regard to perception, here's a study we ran a while ago that we're now trying to follow up on. where we had a very simple setup. We got people into the lab and we showed them a basket that was filled with golf balls, and we asked them to make an estimate of the weight. And we did this in two conditions. So there were two different groups of participants. One group of participants had the expectation that they were going to lift the box alone, and so they made the weight judgment before and after lifting the box on their own. And another group of participants had the expectation that they were going to lift this box together. The other participant was at the other side of the room, so they could see each other but could not talk to each other, and they could not see the weight judgment that the other made. And our hypothesis here was that if people anticipate what they're going to do next, and if that has any effect on their perception of object weight, we should actually see that they judge the weight as lower when they're expecting to lift together compared to when they're expecting to lift alone. And this is also what we saw in the data. So you can see here that before lifting, they significantly underestimate the weight when they are anticipating that they will be lifting the box together, even though they haven't done any lifting yet. And this experiment was single trial just to make sure that there wasn't any influence of having had the experience. And after lifting, in this particular experiment, their judgments were actually identical for joint and solo lifting. So they had a better estimate of the weight after having lifted it. But the interesting part is really the fact that they were underestimating the weight before lifting the box. Now, to understand a little bit more about the processes that are involved here, we ran a follow-up experiment where the co-actor was either healthy or injured. So the injured co-actor pretended to have been in a car accident. And you can already guess our predictions here. So we thought that if people really anticipate the effort and what it sort of will feel like to lift the box together with the other, then they should only underestimate the weight when the co-actor is healthy. And that's also what we saw in this study. So we see this lower judgment of the weight specifically when the co-actor was healthy. We don't see it when the co-actor was injured. And in fact, when the co-actor was injured, the judgment was just the same as when people were acting or anticipating to act on their own, either in the presence of a healthy or an injured confederate who was not doing any lifting with them. So this is just one of many possible examples to show that even a sort of quite minimal social context can have quite a profound effect on how we see things. And likewise, in the domain of action planning, we can see these strong effects of others on the way we plan our own actions. So if you imagine walking down the street alongside a friend of yours, and your friend has an obstacle in their way, what your friend needs to do is they need to take a very long step and possibly also lift their foot higher than they normally would. Now, you walking next to them don't have the same kind of challenge, and you could just walk normally. But what might happen if you consider their task or their situation and the obstacle in their way, what might happen is that you making steps as if the obstacle was in your way. So this is what we wanted to investigate in this study that was performed by Laura Schmitz, who finished her PhD a while ago. And she didn't want to actually look at walking, but she looked at manual movements that people made. So participants were either facing each other or sitting side by side. That didn't really make a difference for the results. And they moved an object towards a target location. Their task was to hit the target location at the same time. So they were instructed to coordinate in time. And one of them always had an obstacle while the other didn't. And we were specifically interested in the movement of the person who did not have an obstacle to see whether their co-actor having an obstacle would make any difference. And in particular, whether they would show a higher movement amplitude when their co-actor had an obstacle. What you see plotted here is the vertical position of the hand, so the movement height, as people are moving forwards. And regardless of whether they were facing each other or sitting side by side, what we see is that they are indeed making a higher movement when their co-actor has an obstacle in their way. And interestingly, they do this also when they cannot see their co-actor. So there could have been a simple explanation where we have something like visual motor interference, where just seeing the other creates a tendency to perform the same movement. But when we have an occluder so that they cannot see their partner, they are still moving their hand higher, suggesting that it is the knowledge about the other's obstacle that is driving this change in their action planning or action execution as well here. So these are just examples to remind you that social interaction shapes how we perceive the world and how we integrate others in our planning. And given that we seem to have this sort of fundamental tendency to be influenced by others, we thought, well, maybe it's actually worth taking a step back and asking ourselves how it is that we actually decide to coordinate with other people. Because what you can do when you are physically in a sort of joint action together is that you can care about your own movement costs, or you can care about the other's costs. So you could try to be altruistic and try to make things easy for the other, or you could take the perspective of the group and simply try to figure out what's optimal for the two of you taken together. And this is, taking us also to the question of the extent to which we act rationally and we make rational decisions when we are in joint actions. So it is sort of rational from a group level perspective that you minimize both your own and the other's costs, and it might be irrational to just reduce your own or the other's costs. But we wanted to see whether people would actually be rational at this level. And I'm going to show you two studies that at first sight seem sort of slightly contradictory to me, because in one study we find that people act very rationally, in the other study we find that people act very irrationally. And so for the purpose of this talk, I thought, what's the solution here? How can we reconcile these two findings? And I'll make a proposal at the very end and see if you find it convincing or not. So the first study is the one where people act very rationally. And this study was inspired by the idea that sometimes you want to meet someone and you have to figure out where to do that. So if you imagine meeting your friend in a park and you want to sit down on a bench to have a chat, you're coming from opposite directions. One thing you could do is you could try to minimize your own effort and just take the first bench that comes your way, sit down, wait for your friend to walk all the way. You could also try to be very polite and walk very fast and try to cover as much distance as possible so as to see your friend near where they are. Or you could try to be rational from this group level perspective and just try to compute what is the minimal distance for you and the other. So just simply sum up the costs where distance here is sort of standing in for the costs. And so we tried to get this into an experiment. This is work by Gina Turek, who's just finishing her PhD thesis these days. And she came up with a little game that people played on a touch screen. The touch screen was in between two participants facing each other, and they simply moved a ball to one of two gaps, and then the other person would move from their home base and pick up the ball and drag it into their home base. So very simple coordination game. Participants did not see the dotted lines that you see here. These are just for illustration purposes. And what you can see is if you look at the person here who has the ball, if they move to the left, this is obviously shorter than if they move to the right from their own point of view, but it is also shorter overall. If you compute the overall distance, it is shorter. So this is an example of a congruent trial. Now here's an incongruent trial. Here, if they move left, it's shorter for them, but it forces their co-actor to go a long way. And overall, if you compute the two distances, then this is the longer path. So this is an incongruent trial. So they should be taking the long path in order to be optimal, in order to minimize the distance overall. And finally, we also included neutral trials where the overall distance covered by the two actors was identical. And so therefore we could see whether people had a preference to minimize their own costs or whether they had a preference to be polite and so minimize the distance for the other. And we see a fairly clear pattern of results across several experiments. Here's one of these experiments. What you say is that on congruent trials, people take the short path, which is also the one that happens to be shorter for the diet. But on incongruent trials, they are actually taking the long path most of the time. So they seem to be aware of the fact that it makes sense to take the long path because overall this is minimizing the costs for the two of them. And on neutral trials, we see a slight bias towards politeness. So people more often take the longer path, which means that the other one has the shorter path. but it's not a very strong bias. And we have meanwhile run more experiments where we don't see that as much. So this may depend a bit on the particular task and context. Now, one worry we had was that in this particular task, it's very easy to compute the distance because you could just imagine covering the whole distance yourself. So you could imagine making a movement where you drag the ball from one place to the other, not just to the gap in between. And that would give you a very simple way of finding out which path is the shorter one. So we came up with a slightly different version of this game where we force people to compute the distances separately, if they do that at all. So here they start again from a little home base, and one of them decides whether to move to a circle or to a square, and the other one has to pick the matching object. So the task here is to always pick a matching object. So if actor A1 goes to the circle, it means that actor 2 needs to go to B2, so has to cover quite a long distance. And so in this way, we can actually more clearly separate the individual costs that an actor, him or herself, incurs and the costs of the other. And if we are right that people are just summing up the costs, we should see that they're still able to make these sort of optimal or rational decisions in this kind of task. This is ongoing work, so I'm just showing you one plot here where what you see in A, B, and C is basically model predictions, what the data should look like if people were to minimize their own cost, the other cost, or the joint cost. So we always compare here what we call self and other disparity. This is simply the distance between your own two objects compared to the distance between the other person's two objects. And what you can see by looking at panel D is that our data most closely resemble the joint cost minimizing model. So even though in this task it is harder to see what the minimal distance for both actors is, and there is overall a bit more noise in the data, we see that people are quite good in optimizing the movements for the two of them, so in minimizing the distance, in other words. Now, this was the study where people are sort of nicely optimal optimal is a strong word, but are at least sort of quite rational from a group level point of view, seem to consider what is best for the two of them and able to implement that. Now, here's a slightly different task that is inspired by a so-called shelling game. In a shelling game, you are asked to coordinate with someone without having the possibility to communicate. So, for instance, Schelling in the 60s asked people to say where they would meet a friend in Paris. And a lot of people say, I would meet my friend at the Eiffel Tower at noon. Why do they say that? They say that because both the Eiffel Tower and noon are sort of focal points. They're very salient. They're more salient than, let's say, 10 a.m. in the morning and some obscure cafe in Paris. So if you have no means to communicate with the other and to coordinate, it's a good idea to just go for something that stands out, for something that is salient. Now, if you sort of if you give people problems where only one option stands out, or at least where one option clearly stands out the most, they might be able to do this. But we started thinking, what if there's another option that also seems quite plausible, and given the uncertainty that people have, they might start thinking quite a bit about the other and what the other is thinking about their choice, and it's becoming a little bit more difficult. So to illustrate, sorry about the flickering lines. To illustrate, on the left here you see a traditional shelling game where if you were asked to pick the same item as another person, you would probably pick the circle because the circle is the one that's different from all the others. Now, in our modified version, we had two standouts. So imagine that you had to pick one of these 4 images in order to coordinate with another person so that you end up picking the same. Which one would you pick? It's a little bit less obvious here, right? Because both the circle and the large triangle stand out. Now, we piloted these stimuli such that one would stand out more than the other. So a lot of people, when you ask them, would say that they would pick the circle probably because it has a different shape and therefore is more distinct from the others. But there are also people who think that the large triangle stands out the most. So we came up with a number of stimuli that all had this kind of structure, and we collected a baseline from individuals who were simply asked to say which object stood out to them. And so you can see that there is agreement among people. They tend to pick the most salient object. And we were also right in sort of predicting that people would pick the second most salient one much more often than one of the unlikely ones. So the unlikely ones are identical. It would be really strange to say that one of those stands out for you. Okay, so now you can imagine that if we simply take individual judgments and we match them, people will more often than not end up being coordinated. So if you are now asked to actually agree on someone else, so that you pick the same object, it would be the best strategy. In fact, the only reasonable strategy is to pick the item that stands out the most to you. There's nothing else you can do, right? And I'll show you in a minute what people actually did. I just want to mention before I do that that we also were interested in trust here. So this is a collaboration with James Strachan, who was a postdoc in my group, and with Ruti Mayo at the Hebrew University. And she's really an expert on studying trust as in dispositional trust or distrust. So not just the trust you have towards a specific individual, but more your attitude. So you generally think that other people are trustworthy or not. And we actually had some hypotheses about trust interfering with coordination, and perhaps trust also making people identify different items as salient. Turns out the data are telling a different story. So here on the left, you just see again the individual plot, just to remind you what people choose when they are asked to say what stands out to them. And what you see on the right is the results of two different conditions. Unidirectional is a condition where we ask people to try and guess what another individual picked. So we say someone already made their choice, try and pick the same. Bidirectional is a condition where we tell them there is an online partner and they are also trying to pick the same as you. So both of you are trying to pick the same. And what you can see is that in both of these conditions, the amount of times that people pick the most salient item goes down, and they more often pick either the second most salient item, but even the unlikely item. And you can see that especially the people who score high on this dispositional trust tend to pick unlikely items. So they go for one of the identical items in the hope that the other person, or thinking that the other person might have picked the same. And we were initially very puzzled by this. So we ran quite a few studies to replicate this. It's a really, really stable finding. So people seem to have this bias. We see the bias also in people who are low on trust. So everyone has it. It's just that people who are high on trust seem to have it more. And of course, this has consequences for coordination. So here you see coordination scores, where we simply match someone's choice with everyone else's choice from that group. And if you look sort of in the column on the left, you see the score for individuals, where we just sort of pretend that people were paired, but they were actually individual choices. And you see that the coordination scores are higher than in the unidirectional and the bidirectional case, and they're actually lowest in the bidirectional case. So when people think they are online coordinating with someone else, perhaps what happens is that they think a lot about the other and they're really trying to guess what the other might be choosing. And this actually turns out to be very detrimental for coordination, because it leads them away from the salient option and makes them pick something that's not salient and that doesn't stand out. So we can say that people tend to act rationally at the group level when it comes to minimizing joint movement costs. However, we find they deviate from this strategy in a shelling game, especially people high on trust. And right now we are directly testing this idea that this may be due to over-mentalizing. So we're now running an experiment where we instruct people to either think a lot about the partner or not think about the partner and go for their own perception. And so hopefully we can see that it really is the thinking about the partner that does it. If not, we'll have to look further for the mechanism. So to come back to this discrepancy between the two studies, what's going on there? I think one possibility is that it's much easier for us to optimize decisions about how to coordinate when real effort is at stake. So we know from studies of individual motor control that people are really, really good at judging the effort that is involved and at acting in efficient ways. And so they seem to be able to also apply this to joint action settings. So no problem with real physical effort. But when you move to a more abstract coordination space, where you don't have any physical costs and you simply need to think sort of rationally in terms of common knowledge, it seems that people can be misled by thinking too much about the partner. So to conclude overall, I think it's fair to say that our minds are deeply social, not just sort of endowed with specific functions that allow us to interact with others, but even showing traces of social interaction when we don't necessarily want to be influenced by others. So we've seen that social interaction or anticipation of joint action can shape how we perceive object properties, in particular weight. There's actually a lot of evidence. I just gave you one example suggesting we include others in our action planning, again, even when we are not aware of this. And finally, we make a decision in line with what is best for the group as long as physical effort is involved. But in more abstract coordination contexts, we may get carried away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That's a really, really fascinating talk with loads of data. And we have several questions coming up online, but do post more questions, type them in the chat box. A couple of questions. This is about some of the studies that you presented at the beginning. So when you're talking about participants lifting their arm higher when their partner has an obstacle, and that they do this even if they can't see the partner. I think the question was, is the effect size exactly the same in both conditions, or is there a bigger effect if you can see the partner?
I would have to go back to the paper to really check, but as far as I remember, it was the same. So it really made no difference whether or not they could see the partner moving.
Mm-hmm. And presumably when there's a question for me, but when they can't see the partner also cannot see them.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it's not, there isn't an audience effect going on there.
That's right. Yes.
A different question from Veronica says, I was wondering if the action of the other person was easier instead of harder, would there still be coordination, and has that been tested?
Oh, so you mean relative to your own action, if the other
yes,
action
I think
was easier or harder? That's very interesting. We may have one study that speaks a bit to this issue. So we had one study where people were actually jumping and covering different distances, and it's much harder to cover long distance when you're jumping than to cover short distance.
Yeah.
And what we find there is a sort of unidirectional influence, such that the person who has a shorter jump tends to be influenced by the person who has a longer jump. So they would actually jump higher than necessary because the other person is covering a long distance, but the person who was covering the long distance was completely unaffected by the person who had the short distance. So it seems that if you have an easier task than the other, you take into account their obstacle or challenge, so to speak. But if you have a difficult task, you may become more sort of centered on your own actions.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question here from Fomaria. It says, for the task with the touch screen and the footballs, did participants both start moving at the same time, or is there a delay between them?
Yes, this was actually a sequential task where one would move before the other. And we tried out different versions. We had one version where we fixed it so that one was always initiating the action and the other was always just completing the action. But we also had a version where they took turns, and that actually made very little difference. So the pattern of results was the same.
Okay, cool. And a question from Bishma, who says, great talk, Natalie. In the paradigm involving distance estimation, how much effect does individual differences in the ability to estimate distances have on how people behave?
Yes, so I think it's sort of something we can address with this sort of newer version of the task where people need to sort of separately estimate their own and the other's distance. And there, indeed, we see that some people just generally seem to be more accurate than others. So I think there is a limit that comes from sort of the perceivability of the distance, if you will. And you could either think of this as something sort of absolute, that, I mean, for anyone, the distances can be different in such a subtle way that it would be hard to see. And you can, of course, also think of it in terms of individual differences. So we haven't looked at this in any detail, but I guess my prediction would be that if you are someone who has a hard time actually sort of judging distances,
Mm-hmm.
then you would only see the effect for distances where it's very clear what the optimal choice is, and otherwise, yeah, people's data would be more messy.
Yeah. Cool. And a question from Gambik. Could you let participants, if in the shelling game where participants were doing really badly coordinating, if you let them experience the game, see the other people's choices, play a few rounds, would they become more rational? Could we teach them to be rational?
That's a really nice question. I think we could, yes. I mean, I think especially if they get feedback, they would probably realize that, you know, they're not making the right choice. On the other hand, I think it's really something we should actually look at, because you could also imagine that because they now have a sort of interaction history, they really don't go salience, but they come up with some alternative strategy, or at least they try to. So, you know, having more feedback about the partner might also give you the idea that there is a lot more common ground, and that you could, again, you know, go for other options rather than the most salient one. So I think it's really worth doing that in the lab and manipulating how much feedback they have about each other. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And one final question from Sala. It's quite a general question. It says, do you think the effects you mentioned go beyond action and reflect verbal communication? I'm not sure if she's referring to a specific study or if she's talking in general, if this would also apply to verbal communication.
Yeah, I think there have been some attempts, for instance, to look at action prediction in a similar way in the language domain as in the nonverbal domain. So, you know, for action, we know that people have a tendency to predict others' actions and to plan ahead. And there are some studies by Chiara Gambi and Martin Pickering where they try to see whether people would sort of make predictions about, you know, how someone else is going to complete their sentence. And the evidence is a little bit mixed, but I think generally, yeah, of course, people also monitor what someone else is saying and make predictions about the content of others' speech. So there may be similar mechanisms at play in the action domain and in the language domain. And of course, you know, I think the other part of the story is that language itself is a wonderful coordination device. So I think often we can solve coordination problems through language, as in a shelling game. If you could talk to someone, it would be so easy to pick the same item. But then there are also limits. So if it comes to very sort of tight temporal coordination, often talking isn't all that helpful. So that's also an interesting, I think, sort of area for future research to really understand better what role does language play for joint action coordination.
Cool. Thank you very much. Again, I've got lots and lots of people in the chat saying thank you for a great talk. And I'd like to finish off by thanking all of our speakers for giving us a wonderful symposium, for managing with the technology and the fact that we're all in different places, and for sharing some really fascinating data. So thank you again from me, and I will pretend that there's lots and lots of clapping going on and everyone saying well done, and that we should go and get some lunch or coffee or whatever it is in your time zone. Thank you.